The autumn of 1987 arrived in Benton County, Missouri, like a slow-moving fever, quiet, suffocating, inevitable. The kind of season where the air itself seemed to rot. Fields of corn stretched endlessly under gray skies, their stalks brown and brittle, rustling with a sound like whispered confessions. The harvest was late that year, very late. Along County Road 347, where asphalt crumbled into gravel and gravel dissolved into dirt, there stood a farmhouse that everyone in Warsaw knew but few dared to visit. It was a two-story structure with peeling white paint, sagging shutters, and a front porch that leaned slightly to the left, as if the entire building was trying to collapse away from something inside. The mailbox at the edge of the property read, "Hutchins," in faded red letters, though the paint had chipped so badly it looked more like a wound than a name. This was the Hutchins farm. 240 acres of cornfield, soybean rows, and silence. The kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums until you heard your own heartbeat. The kind that made people drive faster when they passed by, windows rolled up tight even in the summer heat. Raymond Hutchins owned that land. Had owned it since 1971, when he returned from Vietnam with a Purple Heart, a limp in his left leg, and eyes that never quite focused on the person he was speaking to. He was 43 years old that autumn, though he looked closer to 60. His face was weathered leather, creased deep with lines that seemed carved rather than earned. His hair, once dark brown, had gone the color of old hay, thin and lifeless. He stood 6 feet tall but walked hunched forward, as if carrying an invisible weight on his shoulders. Raymond rarely came into town. When he did, it was always alone, always at dawn, always for the same things: diesel fuel, chicken feed, Copenhagen chewing tobacco, and a case of Pabst Blue Ribbon. He paid in cash, counted out slowly from a worn leather wallet. He never made small talk, never smiled. The checkout girls at Fisher's General Store whispered that his hands shook when he signed the receipt, that his fingernails were always crusted with dirt so dark it looked black. But Raymond Hutchins wasn't always alone. For 16 years, he'd been married to a woman named Carolyn. Carolyn May Hutchins, née Porter, 38 years old, with auburn hair that fell in waves past her shoulders and green eyes that seemed to hold light even on the cloudiest days. She'd been beautiful once. Everyone agreed on that. The kind of beautiful that made men stumble over their words and women smooth down their dresses when she walked into a room. They'd met in 1971, just 3 months after Raymond came home from the war. She was waitressing at the Sunset Diner on Highway 7, pouring coffee and deflecting marriage proposals from lonely truckers with a smile that promised nothing. Raymond had walked in wearing his army jacket, ordered black coffee and apple pie, and left her a $5 tip on a $2 check. He came back the next day, and the next. By the 4th visit, she'd agreed to dinner. By Christmas, they were married at the Benton County Courthouse with 2 strangers as witnesses. For the first few years, people saw them together. Carolyn would ride into Warsaw in Raymond's pickup truck, sitting close beside him the way young wives did back then. She'd wave at neighbors, shop at the Five and Dime, attend the occasional church social at First Baptist. She had a laugh that sounded like wind chimes, bright and unexpected. She'd talk about planting a garden, maybe getting some chickens, perhaps even having children someday when the farm was more profitable. But slowly, imperceptibly, Carolyn Hutchins began to disappear. First, it was just the church socials she stopped attending. Then the trips to town became less frequent. By 1980, nobody could remember the last time they'd seen her face. The checkout girls at Fisher's would ask Raymond how his wife was doing, and he'd grunt something about her preferring to stay home, that she didn't care much for crowds, that she was busy with the housework. "She's just shy," he'd say, his voice flat and empty as a dead radio station. By 1985, Carolyn Hutchins had become a ghost, a rumor, a memory that people weren't quite sure was real anymore. Some folks said they'd seen her silhouette in the upstairs window of the farmhouse, standing perfectly still behind thin curtains. Others swore they'd heard a woman screaming one night when they drove past the property, though it might have been a fox or a barn owl. Mabel Krieger, who lived 3 miles down the road, claimed she'd spotted Carolyn hanging laundry on the line one morning in 1986. But when Mabel drove past again an hour later to get a better look, the clothesline was empty and the house looked abandoned. Maybe she left him, some people whispered over coffee at the diner. Maybe she's sick, others suggested, their voices dropping to reverent hush. Maybe she's dead, said the ones who'd had too much whiskey and not enough sense. But nobody knew for certain, and in small towns like Warsaw, Missouri, not knowing is worse than any truth. Not knowing breeds imagination. Not knowing turns neighbors into storytellers and storytellers into liars. The autumn of 1987 brought more than just late harvests and gray skies. It brought Deputy Frank Kellerman. Frank was 31 years old, new to the Benton County Sheriff's Department, transferred from Kansas City after what people politely called a situation involving a suspect's broken jaw and an internal affairs investigation that went nowhere. He was broad-shouldered and square-jawed, with dark hair cut military short and eyes the color of creek water. He wore his uniform like armor and spoke with the clipped precision of a man who'd learned to measure every word. On October 14, 1987, Frank was sitting in his patrol car outside Fisher's General Store, working his way through a gas station sandwich and a lukewarm Dr. Pepper, when Ida Fisher herself knocked on his window. She was 72 years old, 4 feet 11 inches of gossip and righteousness, wrapped in a floral dress and orthopedic shoes. "Deputy," she said, her voice sharp as garden shears. "I need to report something." Frank rolled down his window. "What's that, Mrs. Fisher?" "It's about Raymond Hutchins." Frank had heard the name before, though he couldn't place where. "What about him?" Ida's eyes narrowed. "He hasn't bought groceries in 6 weeks." Frank blinked. "I'm sorry. Raymond Hutchins comes in every Saturday morning, has done for 16 years, buys the same things every time. But he hasn't been here since September 5th. She crossed her arms. "And when a man who lives alone on a farm stops buying food, that means something. Maybe he's shopping somewhere else." "There is nowhere else. Not unless he's driving 40 miles to Sedalia, and Raymond Hutchins doesn't drive 40 miles for anything." Ida leaned closer, and Frank could smell peppermint and old perfume. "And there's something else. Tommy Werther, you know Tommy, drives the propane truck. He says he went out to the Hutchins place last week to fill the tank, and Raymond wouldn't let him pass the gate. Just paid him cash right there on the road and told him to leave the truck where it was. Tommy said Raymond looked like he hadn't slept in a month, said his clothes were covered in something dark. Dark like what? Like dirt or blood. Tommy couldn't tell." Frank set down his sandwich. "Did Tommy report this?" "Tommy's scared of Raymond Hutchins. Everyone is." Ida straightened up, smoothing her dress. "I'm just saying, Deputy, that when a man's wife hasn't been seen in years and suddenly he stops acting normal, maybe somebody ought to check on things." Frank watched her walk back into the store, her words settling over him like cold rain. That evening, as the sun bled red through the cornfields and shadows grew long across County Road 347, Frank drove out to the Hutchins farm. He told himself it was just a welfare check. Routine. Nothing to worry about. But when he turned onto that long dirt driveway and saw the farmhouse looming ahead, something in his gut twisted tight. The cornfields surrounding the property were unharvested, the stalks standing in perfect rows like soldiers at attention. There were no lights in the windows, no smoke from the chimney, no dogs barking, just that terrible pressing silence. Frank parked his patrol car and stepped out. The air smelled wrong, sweet and rotten, like fruit left too long in the sun. He walked toward the house, his hand resting instinctively on his service weapon. "Mr. Hutchins," he called out. "This is Deputy Kellerman with the Benton County Sheriff's Department. I'm here for a welfare check." Nothing. Frank climbed the sagging porch steps, the wood groaning under his weight. He knocked on the door. 3 solid raps that echoed inside like gunshots. Still nothing. He tried the handle. Locked. Frank moved along the porch, peering through windows. The glass was so dirty he could barely see inside, but he could make out shapes, furniture covered in dust, dishes piled in a sink, newspapers scattered across a table. And then he saw the basement door. It was standing open, just a crack, revealing a wedge of absolute darkness. And from that darkness came a smell that made Frank's stomach lurch, the unmistakable stench of decay. He stepped back from the window, his heart hammering. "Mr. Hutchins, if you're in there, I need you to come to the door." The only answer was the wind moving through the corn, making those dried stalks whisper secrets to each other. Frank returned to his patrol car and radioed the station. Sheriff Morton's voice crackled back, annoyed at being bothered after hours. "You got probable cause to enter? I've got an open basement door and a smell that could be a dead animal. Or something else." There was a long pause. Then, "Wait there. I'm sending backup." Frank waited as the sun disappeared completely and the darkness became total. He kept his eyes on the farmhouse, on those black windows that looked like empty eye sockets. And somewhere deep in the cornfield, something moved. Just a rustling, quick and furtive. Frank's hand went to his flashlight, but before he could turn it on, he heard another sound. This one from inside the house. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the floor above the basement. Then they stopped. And in the silence that followed, Frank Kellerman understood with terrible clarity that whatever had happened in that house, whatever secrets Raymond Hutchins was keeping, they were about to come screaming into the light. The last harvest had begun. Sheriff Dale Morton arrived 23 minutes later, his cruiser kicking up dust as it skidded to a stop beside Frank's patrol car. He was 58 years old, with a beer gut that strained against his uniform and a face like weathered stone. He'd been sheriff of Benton County for 19 years, and in all that time, he'd dealt with drunk drivers, domestic disputes, and the occasional meth lab. Nothing that prepared him for what waited in the Hutchins farmhouse. Deputy Linda Vasquez came with him, stepping out of the passenger side with a maglite in one hand and her service weapon in the other. She was 26, sharp-eyed and deliberate, with black hair pulled back in a tight bun. She'd grown up in Warsaw, knew every family, every farm, every secret whispered over Sunday dinner. She knew the stories about Raymond Hutchins. "Talk to me, Kellerman," Morton said, hitching up his belt. Frank pointed toward the house. "No response to verbal contact. I observed an open basement door through the window and there's a smell coming from inside. Strong, like something died in there. Could be a raccoon. Could be a busted septic line." "Could be," Frank agreed. "But there were footsteps, inside the house, after I knocked." Vasquez exchanged a glance with Morton. "So someone's home." "Someone's home," Frank confirmed. "But they're not answering." Morton sighed, the sound of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "All right. We've got exigent circumstances. Welfare check, possible deceased person. Occupant not responding. We're going in." He looked at both deputies. "Weapons ready but holstered unless we got a threat. By the book." They approached the house in a triangle formation, Morton in front, Frank and Vasquez flanking. The porch steps groaned under their combined weight. Morton tried the door handle, still locked, then stepped back and drove his boot into the wood just beside the knob. The door burst inward with a crack like breaking bones. The smell hit them immediately. It wasn't just decay. It was layered, complex, a symphony of rot, spoiled meat, mildew, ammonia. Beneath it all, something sweet and cloying that coated the back of the throat. Vasquez gagged, covering her mouth and nose with her sleeve. Frank's eyes watered. "Jesus Christ," Morton muttered, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket and pressing it to his face. They entered with flashlights cutting through the darkness. The interior of the Hutchins house was a time capsule of neglect. Newspapers from months ago were stacked on a coffee table, their headlines faded. Dishes crusted with something dark filled the kitchen sink. A calendar on the wall was still turned to August, and everywhere, on every surface, was a fine layer of dust, except for a single narrow path that led from the front door to the basement. Someone had been walking this path, recently. "Mr. Hutchins," Morton's voice boomed through the house. "This is Sheriff Morton. We're entering your home on a welfare check. If you're here, make yourself known." Silence. They moved through the living room, checking corners, clearing spaces. Frank noticed photographs on the mantel, wedding pictures of Raymond and Carolyn, both young and smiling, his arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder. In the photos, Raymond's eyes were clear, almost happy. Carolyn glowed like a sunrise. But the photographs stopped around 1982. After that, nothing. The basement door stood open, just as Frank had seen through the window. A steep wooden staircase descended into absolute darkness, and from that darkness rose the smell, stronger here, almost solid. Morton shone his flashlight down the stairs. The beam revealed rough wooden steps, concrete walls slick with moisture, and at the bottom, shadows that seemed to move in the light. "Stay tight," Morton said. They descended single file, their footsteps echoing. The temperature dropped with each step, and the smell intensified until it was almost unbearable. Frank breathed through his mouth, trying not to think about what he was inhaling. The basement was larger than expected, stretching the full length of the house. Support beams stood like sentries in the darkness. Old farm equipment lined one wall, rusted shovels, pickaxes, lengths of chain. A workbench covered in tools sat against another wall, and above it, hanging from nails, were more tools, saws, mallets, something that might have been a meat cleaver. And in the center of the room, illuminated by their flashlights, was a dirt floor. Fresh dirt. Someone had been digging. The floor was uneven, with several mounds of earth piled in irregular patterns. Some looked old, settled and compacted. Others were recent, the soil still loose and dark. "Oh, God," Vasquez whispered. Morton's hand moved to his radio. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Morton. We're going to need the State Police Crime Scene Unit at the Hutchins property on County Road 347. And get me a K9 unit, cadaver dog if they got one." Frank counted the mounds. 7. 7 distinct areas where the earth had been disturbed and replaced. "Sheriff," Frank said quietly, "where's Raymond Hutchins?" As if in answer, they heard it, a creak from directly above them, floorboards settling under weight. Someone was upstairs. Morton gestured sharply. "Vasquez, stay here. Frank and I move up." They climbed the basement stairs, weapons now drawn, adrenaline sharpening every sense. They emerged into the kitchen and swept through the first floor again, finding nothing. Then they heard it again. Directly overhead. Second floor. The staircase to the upper level was narrow and dark, the banister worn smooth by decades of hands. Family photographs lined the wall. Raymond as a young man in his army uniform, Carolyn in a summer dress, the two of them standing before the farmhouse on what must have been the day they bought it. In the last photograph, Carolyn's smile looked forced. They reached the second-floor landing. 3 doors, 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. The first bedroom was empty, the bed neatly made with a quilt so old it was falling apart. The bathroom was filthy, the toilet unflushed, the mirror cracked in a spiderweb pattern. The last door was closed. Morton positioned himself on one side, Frank on the other. Morton counted down with his fingers. 3, 2, 1. He kicked the door open. The master bedroom was a shrine to something broken. Clothes scattered across the floor, men's and women's mixed together. The bed was unmade, sheets twisted and stained. But what stopped them cold was the wall. Every inch was covered in photographs of Carolyn. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Some were duplicates of the wedding photos downstairs, but most were candid shots. Carolyn cooking, Carolyn reading, Carolyn sleeping. And as the photographs progressed chronologically around the room, something changed in Carolyn's face. The smile disappeared first, then the light in her eyes. By the end, she looked like a stranger in her own skin, hollow and haunted. And in the most recent photographs, the ones clustered near the window, Carolyn wasn't smiling at all. She was staring directly at the camera with an expression of pure, unfiltered terror. Jesus Christ, Morton breathed. But there was no one in the room. No Raymond, no Carolyn. Frank moved to the window and looked out at the cornfield stretching into darkness. The stalks swayed in the wind, and for just a moment he thought he saw a figure standing among them, perfectly still. Then it was gone. "Sheriff!" Vasquez's voice crackled over the radio, urgent and tight. "You need to get back down here, now!" They ran. In the basement, Vasquez was standing in the center of the dirt floor, her flashlight trained on one of the fresh mounds. She'd been digging. Her hands were covered in soil, and she'd found something. A piece of fabric. Floral pattern, faded but recognizable. A woman's dress. Morton knelt beside the mound, his face gray in the flashlight beam. He pulled his radio. "Dispatch. Expedite that crime scene unit. We've got a possible homicide." Frank stared at the mounds, at the 7 distinct graves, if that's what they were, and felt his skin crawl with a realization he couldn't quite name yet. 7 mounds. But Carolyn was only one person. "Sheriff," Frank said slowly, "how many women have gone missing in Benton County?" Morton looked up, and in his eyes, Frank saw the same terrible understanding taking shape. "In the last 10 years?" Morton's voice was hoarse. "3, maybe 4 if you count the hitchhiker nobody reported." Vasquez's flashlight swept across the basement, illuminating the workbench, the tools, the chains. "He didn't just kill his wife." "No," Morton agreed, standing up. "He didn't." Somewhere above them, in the house or beyond it, wood creaked, a door closing or opening. Frank's radio crackled with static, and through the white noise they heard something that might have been a voice. Distant, distorted, singing. A woman's voice, high and thin, singing something that might have been a lullaby or might have been a scream shaped into melody. The 3 officers looked at each other, and in that moment they understood that whatever happened in this house, whatever Raymond Hutchins had done, the story was far from over. Because Raymond Hutchins was still out there, somewhere in the corn, watching, waiting. And the dead weren't done telling their secrets. The state police arrived at dawn, their vehicles forming a convoy that stretched down County Road 347 like a funeral procession. Crime scene techs in white Tyvek suits, evidence bags in hand, descended on the Hutchins farmhouse as the sun broke red over the horizon. The cadaver dog, a German shepherd named Maggie, hit on all 7 mounds within the first hour. Deputy Frank Kellerman stood outside the house, watching the organized chaos unfold, a cup of gas station coffee going cold in his hands. He hadn't slept. None of them had. They'd spent the night securing the scene, setting up a perimeter, and trying not to think about what they'd found in that basement, or what they'd heard. The singing had stopped around 3 a.m., as abruptly as it began. No explanation. No source ever found. Morton had searched the upper floor twice. Vasquez had cleared the outbuildings, and Frank had walked the perimeter of the cornfield with his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing. Just wind and corn, and that terrible, watching silence. By 9 a.m., they'd exhumed the first body. Frank watched from a distance as the crime scene techs carefully removed soil, layer by layer, with the precision of archaeologists. The body bag was small, too small, and when they lifted it from the ground, Frank saw one of the techs, a man who'd worked homicides in St. Louis for 15 years, turn away and vomit into the cornstalks. Detective Sarah Reeves was the lead investigator from the state police, a woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She'd arrived at dawn, reviewed the scene, and immediately requested additional personnel. Now she stood beside Frank, watching the exhumation, her face carved from stone. "How long you been a deputy, Kellerman?" she asked. 8 months in Benton County, 2 years in Kansas City before that. You ever work a case like this? No, ma'am. Good. Most people never do. She lit a cigarette, her hands steady. Most people never should. By noon, they had 3 bodies out of the ground. The medical examiner, Dr. Philip Chen, brought in from Jefferson City, had set up a temporary morgue in the back of a refrigerated truck. Frank watched him work through the open doors, saw him photograph, measure, document with the methodical precision of someone who'd long ago learned to separate himself from what he was seeing. "First victim, Doctor," Chen announced to the assembled officers, his voice clinical and flat. "Is female, approximately 5'6", late 30s to early 40s. Been in the ground at least 2 years, possibly longer. Cause of death appears to be blunt force trauma to the skull. Significant pre-mortem injuries consistent with sustained physical abuse." Frank's stomach turned. "Second victim is female, 5'3", mid-20s. In the ground approximately 18 months. Cause of death is strangulation. Hyoid bone is fractured. Again, evidence of sustained abuse prior to death." Vasquez was standing beside Frank now, her arms crossed tight across her chest. She'd grown up 3 miles from this farm. She'd driven past it hundreds of times. "How did nobody know?" she whispered. "Because nobody looked," Frank said. "The third victim was the smallest." Dr. Chen's voice cracked just slightly when he gave the details. "Female, approximately 16 to 18 years old. In the ground less than a year. Multiple stab wounds to the torso. Evidence suggests she was alive when she was buried." The silence that followed was absolute. Detective Reeves crushed out her cigarette. "We need to find Raymond Hutchins. Now." But Raymond Hutchins had vanished. By the afternoon, they'd brought in tracking dogs, search and rescue teams, and a helicopter from the highway patrol. They searched the cornfields, the outbuildings, the woods that bordered the property to the north. They found a hunting blind near the property line, empty beer cans scattered around it. They found a burn pile behind the barn with remnants of women's clothing, partially incinerated. They found a root cellar that hadn't been opened in years, but no Raymond. It was Vasquez who found the journals. She'd been searching the upstairs bedroom, the shrine room, when she noticed that one section of the wall behind the photographs sounded hollow when she tapped it. She pulled down the pictures, found a loose panel, and behind it, a space carved into the wall studs. Inside were 19 spiral notebooks, the kind kids used in school, filled cover to cover with Raymond Hutchins' handwriting. They were dated. The first one started in 1979. Vasquez brought them down to Detective Reeves, who spread them across the hood of her cruiser and began to read. Frank watched her face change, watched the professional mask crack just slightly. "Jesus Christ," Reeves breathed. He documented everything. The journals were a map of madness, a descent recorded in meticulous detail. Raymond wrote about the war, about the things he'd seen in Vietnam, about the way killing had felt necessary and right. He wrote about coming home and trying to be normal, trying to be the man Carolyn deserved, but feeling the violence inside him growing like a tumor. He wrote about the first time he hit her. November 1977. She'd burned dinner, and something in him had snapped. He described the sound her head made when it hit the wall, described the way she'd looked at him afterward, not with anger, but with fear. And he'd liked that fear. The entries became darker, more detailed. He wrote about isolating her, cutting her off from friends and family, making sure nobody came to the farm. He wrote about the pleasure he took in her submission, in her silence, in the way she stopped fighting back. And then, in 1983, he wrote about the hitchhiker. Her name was Rachel, or at least that's what she'd said. She was 23, running from something in Kansas, trying to get to family in Tennessee. Raymond had picked her up on Highway 7, told her he'd give her a ride to the next town. Instead, he'd brought her to the farm. The journal entry was 5 pages long, detailing exactly what he'd done to her over the course of 3 days before he finally strangled her and buried her in the basement. He wrote about it the way someone might write about planting crops, methodical, practical, without emotion. "He's a serial killer," Frank said. "Yes," Reeves confirmed. And based on these journals, Carolyn wasn't just a victim, she was a witness. She knew what he was doing, and she was too terrified to tell anyone. They found Carolyn's body at sunset. She was the 7th mound, the largest, the one closest to the basement stairs. Dr. Chen supervised the exhumation personally, and when they finally uncovered her, even the hardened crime scene techs went quiet. Carolyn Hutchins had been buried wearing her wedding dress. It was rotted, stained with soil and decay, but unmistakable. White lace, long sleeves, a train that had been carefully arranged around her body. Her red hair, still partially intact, was spread out around her head like a halo. And on her left hand, her wedding ring still caught the dying light. "Cause of death?" Reeves asked quietly. Dr. Chen knelt beside the body, examining carefully. Multiple broken bones, ribs, arms, fingers. Severe head trauma, but... He paused, his gloved hands gentle on what remained of Carolyn's skull. This didn't kill her quickly. These injuries happened over time. Weeks, maybe months. "He beat her to death," Vasquez said. "Slowly." "Yes." Dr. Chen's voice was heavy. "And when she finally died, he dressed her up and buried her like she was something precious to him." Frank thought about the photographs upstairs, about the way Raymond had documented every moment of Carolyn's fear. About the journals describing years of abuse, years of torture, years of turning a living woman into a ghost long before she died. "He loved her," Frank said, the words tasting like poison. In his own sick way, he actually loved her. "That's not love," Vasquez snapped. "That's ownership." As the sun disappeared and floodlights illuminated the crime scene, Detective Reeves gathered everyone for a briefing. 7 victims had been recovered. 7 women who'd trusted the wrong man, gotten into the wrong truck, knocked on the wrong door asking for help. The youngest was 16. The oldest was Carolyn at 38. All of them had died slowly. All of them had suffered. "We have a statewide APB out on Raymond Hutchins," Reeves announced. "White male, 43, 6 feet tall, approximately 170 pounds, brown and gray hair, blue eyes, walks with a limp. He should be considered extremely dangerous. He knows this area, he's been planning this, and he's not going to go down easy." "Where could he go?" Morton asked. "He's got no family, no friends, no money we know about." "He's got 240 acres of corn," Frank said, "and he knows every inch of it." They resumed the search at first light, but the cornfield had become a labyrinth. The stalks were dense, 7 feet tall, planted in perfect rows that extended for acres in every direction. Visibility was limited to a few feet in any direction. Sounds echoed strangely. Every rustle could be wind or could be Raymond moving just out of sight. The search teams moved in formation, cutting lines through the corn with machetes, calling out to each other to maintain contact. The helicopter circled overhead, its thermal imaging camera scanning for heat signatures. But the October sun had warmed the earth, and everything below the canopy registered the same temperature. Frank was on the western edge of the search grid when he found the first sign. A clearing, roughly circular, where the corn stalks had been cut down and arranged in a pattern. They formed a spiral, leading inward to a center point where the earth had been disturbed. Fresh digging. "Detective Reeves," Frank radioed. "I've got something." They converged on his location, and Dr. Chen brought a portable ground-penetrating radar unit. The readings came back immediate and conclusive. Something was buried here, something recent. They dug carefully, expecting another body. Instead, they found a metal box, rusted and old, the kind soldiers used to store personal items. Inside were photographs, not of the victims, but of Raymond himself. Pictures from Vietnam, from combat, from moments he'd documented, and beneath the photographs, wrapped in oilcloth, was a pistol, a .45 caliber M1911 standard military issue. It was loaded. "He's planning something," Reeves said, staring at the empty box. "He buried his weapon here, in a specific place he could find again. This is a cache point." "A cache point for what?" Vasquez asked. "For when he's ready to end this." And as if summoned by her words, they heard it again. The singing. That high, thin woman's voice carrying through the cornfield, wordless but unmistakably human. Closer now. Much closer. Every officer reached for their weapon. "Spread out," Reeves commanded. "Stay on comms. Nobody goes off alone." But the singing seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the stalks, bouncing off the dry leaves, surrounding them. Frank moved toward it, his service weapon drawn, his heart hammering. And then he saw her. A woman, standing perfectly still between the corn rows, maybe 30 feet away. She was wearing a dress, floral pattern, exactly like the one they'd found in the first grave. Her hair was long and dark, hanging in front of her face. She was barefoot, and her feet were crusted with dirt. "Ma'am," Frank called out, his voice steady despite the ice in his veins. "I'm Deputy Kellerman. I need you to identify yourself." The woman didn't move, didn't speak. But the singing, that terrible singing, was coming from her direction. Frank took a step forward, then another. "Ma'am, we're here to help you. Can you tell me your name?" The woman's head tilted, just slightly. And then she began to walk, not toward Frank, but deeper into the corn. Her movements were strange, jerky, like a marionette with tangled strings. "Wait!" Frank started after her, pushing through the stalks. Behind him, he heard Vasquez shouting, heard Reeves calling on the radio, but he couldn't stop. The woman was right there, just ahead, always just out of reach. And then the corn opened up into another clearing, this one larger, and Frank stopped dead. Raymond Hutchins was waiting for him. He was sitting on the ground, his back against a cornstalk, the .45 pistol in his hand. His clothes were filthy, his face gaunt and hollow, his eyes feverishly bright. He looked like he'd aged 20 years in 2 days, but he was smiling. "Deputy," Raymond said, his voice a dry rasp, "I've been expecting you." Frank's weapon was trained on Raymond's chest. "Put the gun down, Mr. Hutchins." "In a minute." Raymond's smile widened. "First, I want you to meet someone." And from behind Frank, from the corn he'd just walked through, the woman emerged. She stepped into the clearing, and in the daylight, Frank finally saw her face. It was Carolyn Hutchins, or something wearing her face. The features were right, the bone structure, the green eyes, even the auburn hair. But something was fundamentally wrong. The way she moved, the way she stared without blinking, the way her smile was too wide, showing too many teeth. "She came back to me," Raymond whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I buried her, but she came back. They all did. Every night they come back." Frank's radio crackled. Vasquez's voice. "Frank, where are you?" But Frank couldn't speak, couldn't move. Because the woman who looked like Carolyn was walking toward Raymond, and behind her, emerging from the corn in a slow, terrible procession, were 6 more women, all of them wearing the clothes they'd been buried in. All of them with that same wrong smile. Raymond pressed the pistol against his temple. "She forgave me," he said. "They all forgave me, and now I can be with them forever." "Don't," Frank started. The gunshot echoed across the cornfield, sending crows screaming into the sky. Raymond Hutchins collapsed, his blood soaking into the soil he'd worked for 16 years, and the women, all 7 of them, simply vanished like smoke in wind. Frank stood alone in the clearing, the echo of the gunshot still ringing in his ears, and wondered if he'd seen what he thought he'd seen, or if the cornfield had driven him as mad as it had driven Raymond Hutchins. The official report stated that Deputy Frank Kellerman had pursued suspect Raymond Hutchins into the cornfield at approximately 10:47 a.m. on October 16, 1987, that the suspect, when cornered, had taken his own life with a single gunshot to the head. That Deputy Kellerman had been alone when it happened. That backup arrived within 3 minutes of the gunshot. The official report made no mention of the women. Frank sat in Detective Reeves's makeshift command center, a folding table set up in the bed of her pickup truck, and gave his statement 3 times. Each time, he left out the part about Carolyn and the others emerging from the corn. Each time, he described Raymond's final words without mentioning the forgiveness, the reunion, the terrible joy in the dying man's eyes. Some truths, Frank had learned, were too dangerous to speak aloud. "You did good work, Kellerman," Reeves said, signing off on his statement. She looked exhausted, her gray hair hanging limp, her eyes bloodshot. "This case is going to haunt me for the rest of my career, but you did good work." "Did I?" Frank stared at his hands. They'd stopped shaking hours ago, but he could still feel the tremor beneath his skin. 7 women are dead. Raymond Hutchins is dead. What exactly did I do? You found them. You gave them names. You gave their families closure. Reeves lit another cigarette. In this job, sometimes that's all you can do. But Frank knew it wasn't closure. Closure implied an ending, a final chapter, a story resolved. This wasn't resolved. This was a wound that would never fully heal. The identifications came slowly, painfully over the following weeks. Carolyn May Hutchins, née Porter, 38, confirmed through dental records. Married to Raymond Hutchins for 16 years, no children, no siblings. Her parents had died in 1981, never knowing what happened to their daughter. The last person to see her alive, outside of Raymond, had been Mabel Krieger, the neighbor, who'd spotted her hanging laundry in the spring of 1986. That was 18 months before she died. Rachel Ann Morrison, 23, the hitchhiker from Kansas. She'd been reported missing in August 1983 by her sister in Topeka, but the trail had gone cold immediately. No witnesses, no leads. Just another young woman who'd vanished on a highway that swallowed people like a river swallows stones. Her sister flew to Missouri for the funeral, a small woman with Rachel's same dark hair and empty eyes. Jennifer Cole, 19, from Springfield, Missouri. She'd disappeared in March 1985 while driving to visit her boyfriend in Kansas City. Her car had been found abandoned on Highway 7, keys still in the ignition, purse on the passenger seat. The official theory had been that she'd accepted a ride from someone and met with foul play. They'd been right, but 4 hours too late. Jennifer's parents attended the funeral. Her mother collapsed at the graveside. Nicole Peterson, 26, a nurse from Sedalia. She'd vanished in December 1985 after her shift at Bothwell Regional Health Center. Her car had been found in the hospital parking lot, driver's side door open, engine running. She'd left behind a husband and a 3-year-old son. The husband had remarried 6 months ago. He didn't attend the funeral. Amanda Reese, 16, a runaway from Jefferson City. She'd been living on the streets for 8 months before she disappeared in May 1987. No missing person report had ever been filed. Her parents thought she was with friends. Her friends thought she'd gone home. And by the time anyone realized she was gone, the trail was cold. She'd been buried alive. Dr. Chen confirmed she'd clawed at the earth above her grave, her fingernails broken and torn, before she suffocated. The 6th and 7th victims remained unidentified. Victim 6 was approximately 30 years old, in the ground for 3 to 4 years. No dental records matched. No missing person reports fit her description. She was buried in Benton County Cemetery, in a grave marked only with a number, Jane Doe, 8706. Victim 7 was approximately 28, in the ground for 2 years. Same story. No matches. No name. No one claimed her. She was buried beside Victim 6, Jane Doe, 8707. Detective Reeves stood at their grave sites on a cold November morning, watching the groundskeeper fill in the earth. Frank stood beside her, hands in his coat pockets, watching his breath mist in the air. 2 women, Reeves said quietly, and nobody even knows they're gone. Someone knows, Frank said. Somewhere, someone is wondering where they are. Maybe. Or maybe they're just like Amanda Reese, people nobody missed until it was too late. The Hutchins farm was declared a crime scene for 6 weeks. When the investigation finally concluded, the property was seized by the county. Nobody wanted to buy it. Nobody wanted to touch it. The house stood empty, windows boarded up, a padlock on the door. The cornfield was never harvested that year. The stalks stood through winter, turning black and skeletal, until finally the county hired a crew to burn it all in the spring. Frank drove out to watch the burning. He stood at the property line, feeling the heat on his face, watching the flames consume the corn row by row. The smoke rose in a black column that could be seen from Warsaw, and for 3 days the smell of burning hung over Benton County like a pall. When it was over, nothing remained but scorched earth and ash. But the stories didn't stop. People claimed they saw lights in the abandoned farmhouse at night, flickering in the upstairs windows. Teenagers dared each other to approach the property, and more than one came running back with stories of voices calling from inside, of figures standing in the empty doorways, of hands reaching out from the basement. The county sheriff's department responded to calls about the property 17 times in the first year alone. Every time they found nothing, just an empty house and the wind. Frank stopped going. He knew what he'd seen in that cornfield, what he'd heard, what he'd felt. He knew that some places hold on to their horror, that some soil remembers the blood fed into it. The Hutchins farm was one of those places, and no amount of burning or bulldozing would change that. Raymond Hutchins' journals became evidence in a case that would never go to trial. They were catalogued, photographed, and sealed in the State Police Evidence Facility in Jefferson City. Detective Reeves had read every page, all 19 notebooks, and told Frank that she wished she hadn't. He was methodical, she said over drinks at a bar in Warsaw, 6 months after it was over. Every victim, he documented their last words, documented their pleas, documented the moment they stopped fighting. She drained her whiskey. And you know what the worst part was? Frank waited. He thought he was doing them a favor. He genuinely believed he was giving them purpose, meaning a place in his world. He thought he loved them, all of them, especially Carolyn. Reeves signaled for another drink. He wrote about her like she was a saint, like she'd sacrificed herself for him, like her suffering was an act of devotion. That's not love, Frank said. No, but he couldn't tell the difference. And that's what makes monsters, Kellerman, not the cruelty, the inability to understand that cruelty is what they're doing. Frank thought about that often in the months that followed. Thought about Raymond Hutchins, sitting in his house, surrounded by photographs of the woman he'd tortured for years, genuinely believing he was expressing love. Thought about the 7 women buried in that basement, reduced to objects, to possessions, to things Raymond could control and destroy at will. And he thought about the moment Raymond had smiled, tears streaming down his face, and said, "She forgave me." Had it been real? Had Frank actually seen those women emerge from the corn? Or had his mind created the vision his exhausted, traumatized psyche needed to see? He'd never know. And maybe that was the point. Some mysteries don't have solutions. Some questions don't have answers. Some stories don't end. They just stop. The Benton County Examiner ran the story for weeks, each revelation more horrific than the last. National news picked it up. 48 Hours did a special. People magazine ran a cover story with Carolyn's wedding photo, her smile frozen in time, the headline reading, "The Farmer's Wife, a Marriage Built on Graves." Warsaw became known as that town where the serial killer was. Tourism increased, dark tourism, people driving by the Hutchins farm taking photographs, trying to feel something they couldn't name. The local economy saw a brief uptick, then crashed when the novelty wore off, and people realized there was nothing to see but scorched earth and a boarded-up house. Deputy Linda Vasquez transferred to the Kansas City Police Department 3 months after the case closed. She told Frank she couldn't drive past that farm anymore, couldn't live in a town where everyone knew what had happened, couldn't sleep without seeing Carolyn's body in her wedding dress, arranged like a bride on her way to a ceremony that would never end. Sheriff Morton retired 6 months later, cited health reasons, but everyone knew the truth. He'd been sheriff for 19 years, and for most of that time, Raymond Hutchins had been torturing and killing women less than 10 miles from his office. He couldn't live with that knowledge. Frank stayed. He didn't know why, exactly. Maybe because running felt like abandoning those 7 women. Maybe because someone needed to remember, to bear witness, to make sure the story didn't get simplified into something comfortable and digestible. The truth was messy. The truth was that an entire community had failed to see what was happening, had ignored the warning signs, had let Raymond Hutchins isolate and control his wife until she became invisible. The truth was that multiple women had disappeared, and nobody had connected the dots because it was easier to believe in bad luck and poor choices than to believe a monster lived among them. The truth was that evil didn't announce itself. It smiled and bought groceries and paid in cash and called you ma'am and sir and went home to commit atrocities that the human mind could barely comprehend. On October 16, 1988, exactly 1 year after Raymond Hutchins's death, Frank drove out to the property alone. The county had finally sold it to a developer who planned to subdivide it into residential lots. The farmhouse would be demolished. The land would be graded and paved and covered with identical suburban homes. The horror would be buried beneath foundation and sod. Frank stood where the house had been, looked out at the empty field where the corn had once grown, and he swore he could still hear it. That singing, high and thin and wordless. The sound of women who'd never gotten to finish their songs, who'd been silenced mid-note, who'd been planted in the earth like seeds that would never bloom. He'd never reported what he'd seen that day in the cornfield. Never told anyone about the women walking toward Raymond, about the way they'd looked at Frank with eyes that held something between forgiveness and accusation. He'd kept it inside, letting it calcify into something hard and cold that sat in his chest like a stone. But standing there, on the anniversary, he finally understood what he'd witnessed. It wasn't forgiveness Raymond had received. It was judgment. Those women had come back not to absolve him, but to claim him. To pull him down into the same earth where they'd suffered, to make sure he understood, finally, terribly, what he'd done to them. The smile on Raymond's face hadn't been joy. It had been recognition. He'd seen what waited for him, and he'd pulled that trigger not to join them in peace, but to escape what they would do to him if they caught him alive. Frank drove back to Warsaw as the sun set, painting the sky the color of old blood. He stopped at the cemetery, at the 2 graves marked Jane Doe, and placed flowers on each one. Daisies. Simple, cheap, bought from the grocery store. But it was something. "I'm sorry nobody came for you," he said to the silent stones. "I'm sorry nobody knew your names. But I won't forget you were here. I promise you that." The wind picked up, rustling through the trees, and for just a moment Frank thought he heard that singing again. But when he turned, there was nothing. Just empty graves and lengthening shadows. He walked back to his patrol car, got in, and drove away. Behind him, the cemetery settled into evening stillness. The flowers on the Jane Doe graves swayed in the breeze, and beneath the earth, in darkness and silence, 7 women rested. But rest is not peace, and the corn remembers. Epilogue: What Remains. In 1989, the Hutchins property was developed into Meadowbrook Estates, a subdivision of 12 homes. The first family moved in that June, a young couple with a baby girl. They lasted 4 months before breaking their lease and moving to Kansas. They reported hearing voices in the basement, footsteps on the stairs when nobody was there. Their daughter, barely a year old, would wake screaming at 3 a.m. every night, staring at the corner of her room where nothing stood. 11 other families moved in. 11 other families moved out, all within a year. By 1991, Meadowbrook Estates was abandoned. The houses fell into disrepair, squatters moved in and out. The county condemned the properties in 1995. In 2003, the land was purchased by a farming corporation that tore down the houses and replanted the entire area, with corn. The corn grows tall there now, taller than anywhere else in Benton County. The stalks are thick and healthy, their roots running deep into soil enriched by 17 years of fertilizer and something else nobody talks about. Local farmers won't harvest that field. They say the corn from that land tastes wrong, that animals won't eat it, that if you walk into those rows, you feel watched. And on certain nights, especially in October, especially when the wind blows just right, you can still hear singing. High and thin and wordless, the sound of women who never got to finish their songs. The Hutchins case remains officially solved. Raymond Hutchins, serial killer, 7 confirmed victims, died by suicide, October 16th, 1987. Case closed. But Frank Kellerman, now retired, living in a small house in Springfield, sometimes drives back to Benton County. He parks on County Road 347, looks out at that cornfield, and remembers. Remembers 7 women who deserved better. Remembers a community that failed them. Remembers that monsters don't look like monsters until it's too late. And he remembers that some stories don't end. They just grow. Like corn in cursed soil, forever and ever. Amen. The End Case File, Hutchins, Raymond, Classified Benton County Sheriff's Department, Missouri State Police, Homicide Division. Status, closed. Perpetrator, deceased victims identified. 5 of 7. Location, County Road 347, Benton County, MO date of closure, October 16, 1987. Note from Detective S. Reeves, 11/03, 1987. This case is closed by clearance through death of offender. However, I'm adding this note for any future investigators who might review this file. There are elements of this case that cannot be adequately explained through conventional means. Deputy Kellerman's testimony regarding the events immediately preceding suspect's suicide contains inconsistencies that suggest either acute stress response or something else. I've chosen to omit certain details from the official report. Some truths serve no purpose except to drive those who hear them toward madness. The dead are buried. Let them stay that way. File sealed by order of Detective Sarah M. Reeves, Missouri State Police Badge. 4719, access restricted.